So delighted to be with you all today. I am in Cambridge now, but I am originally from Sunderland and all my family are there, so it's lovely to be back in the northeast this weekend. And I'm really building on things we've heard a little bit about already today. We heard Eleanor and Danny in the galleries talk about Lucie Rie as a sort of refugee, her coming to England and making a new life here. And then also Katie mentioned very much how she's a cosmopolitan potter, and that was often a word that people used to describe Rie. So I'm kind of looking at those two things in a little bit more depth and thinking about her studio, because it's a place which is very, very closely associated with Rie. She lived in this one place, lived and worked in the same small Mews building, 18 Albion Mews. It's near Hyde Park in West London, near Paddington train station. And she was there from 1939 until her death in 1995. So that's 56 years in this one place, both living and working there. And people often used similar kinds of words to describe it. So lots of people who visited said that it was magical, unique, serene. But I'm arguing today that I think it provides an insight into Rie's life that we don't really get in other ways, because as Katie actually mentioned, she didn't write a great deal about her work. She didn't want to discuss it at length. She was quite enigmatic about her work. And the Credo of 1950, which Katie quoted from, I'll just remind you, there's a line in it that says, "Art theories have no meaning for me. Beauty has. This is all my philosophy." So there's not a lot to go on, but I'm arguing instead that actually her presentation of herself and her work and her home give us a bit of an insight into her kind of practice. And this took the form of a pottery on the ground floor and then a tiny flat above, to which friends were invited for coffee and her very famous cakes. She was apparently an amazing baker, known especially for her rock cakes, and people are kind of waxed lyrical about these visits to her and the coffee and cake they'd receive. But of course, downstairs is really kind of where the magic happened, as it were. And it was a very compact building, very meticulously arranged. So you came in through the front door through a lobby, and then you'd come into a sort of informal showroom, which I'll come back to later. And that was the outer room to the pottery itself. So this is where Rie actually sat at the wheel and made all of her pots. You can see her there, she's sitting directly in front of a large window to get as much light as possible. And this is the kick wheel she's sitting at. She brought this from Vienna to London. She brought it with her to throw on. And in the background there, stacked on those shelves, you can see kind of molds. And those are molds for the buttons that are on, some of which are on display downstairs. I'm not going to talk about Albion Mews as the kind of the button factory, because Kimberly this afternoon is going to tell us loads more about that. So I am going to skip over that particular period. But visitors were often very surprised at how clean the pottery was. But Rie wasn't she was not a messy potter. She used very little water in her throwing, so there's very little spatter. So people would say she would sit down to her wheel and get up again just as pristine as when she sat down. So, sort of very sort of immaculate, meticulous person. And then the only other room on the ground floor was a small bathroom. And then upstairs there was a very tiny kitchen, a single bedroom, and her sitting room. And that was the whole of Albion Mews. And that's where she spent, as I say, her entire life in England. And the sitting room especially was often described because it was very, very pale, very, very neutral tones, and we'll see some images of it later, but very, very stark and modern for England in the kind of late 30s, early 40s, and just in the post-war period. But there's a mix of kind of modern and kind of English furniture, but we'll get to that later. So although visitors often described the house as this kind of retreat, and they have this slightly romantic idea, I think, about, the lone artist at work, is kind of, romantic idea sort of Rie engrossed for days on end in her potting. Actually, this space, Albion Mews, had lots of different purposes. It was a site of artistic production, but it was also a space for living, for entertaining, and this appointment-only showroom, which gave her the opportunity to sell directly to her customers. And this is what you can see here. So this is the other room on the ground floor, is this very informal showroom. And it also, though, through the showroom, it gave her kind of clients the chance to peek into the pottery, to see where it all happened, and then to go upstairs and have a a coffee. And I think what's interesting is for someone who is often described as very, very private, Rie was very happy for the pottery and her home to be photographed continuously the entire time she lived there. So there are lots and lots and lots of surviving photographs. And towards the end of her life, these are often published in magazine spreads, books, exhibition catalogues. So this is an example here. This is from 1986. And this is exactly the kind of image we come to associate with Lucie Rie towards the end of her life. She's very diminutive, she always was, but she's very kind of small in later age, usually dressed in white, standing in front of this quite iconic walnut shelving filled with her pots. And she's very much dwarfed, you know, by the shelving and by the pots around her. And also this display we'll see on the table here. And I will come back to it later, but you've already seen this actually on the last slide that Katie showed. Lucie Rie was photographed by Snowdon actually sitting next to it. But you will see this again, and you will see these again on this table. So we'll come back to those later. But this has kind of really entered the public consciousness, this idea of Rie in the studio. And even, it was interesting, downstairs, we've got the David Attenborough Omnibus documentary on display in the gallery. And again, that is filmed in Albion Mews in the pottery. So people who really didn't know Rie still had a really strong sense of the space that in which she lived and worked. So she'd first come to London in 1938 with her husband, Hans Rie. They lived in Hampstead very briefly, along many other kind of refugees from Central Europe. But Hans and Lucie's marriage was already kind of on the rocks, and Hans wanted to continue to North America, like a lot of Jewish refugees did, but Lucie wanted to stay in London, and so this is where the two parted. And she started looking around for a space that would give her the opportunity to live and work and get back to ceramics, which she'd had to abandon in Vienna. So this is the space she found. It was a Mews house. It was originally a garage. So if you imagine the bottom floor is actually, that big window was essentially a hole for a garage, overlooking an ancient burial ground. And she rented it from the church commissioners in 1939 on the condition that she produced high-class pottery only. So the church commissioners being quite fussy there. And she worked with a friend, fellow Austrian, the architect Ernst Freud, son of Sigmund and father of Lucien. And he helped her convert the garage into this kind of living situation. So it's the first Mews house of its kind in the Mews in the street to be converted, and this is where she stayed. And there was a much made throughout her life of her decision to live and work in a city. In England at that time, potteries were not usually in urban environments. Most potteries at that time, a lot of potters were using wood-fired kilns. They're very large, they're very smoky, you need to store tons of wood to fire them. It's really a kind of rural enterprise. So when we were hearing about Leach, Cardew, other people like Catherine Pladle-Bouverie, they were all potters working in the interwar period, but they're all in the countryside. And then Rie comes to London, and she's right in London. She's using a gas kiln and later an electric kiln, so she's not using the wood-fired kilns. But what's interesting is that for Rie, this is completely natural because she's come from a completely different tradition. She's not working in the English tradition, and this has really always been at the heart of her approach. So this is shamelessly stolen from Google Maps 2 days ago, but this is the building in which Lucie grew up in. This is 13 Elisabethstrasse in Vienna, and it gives you a sense of her environment growing up. She was from a very wealthy family. Her father was a hugely respected doctor. They lived a very, very kind of upper middle class life in Vienna, in a very large flat in this building. So I think they had the whole floor of this building. So she's used to living in an urban environment and training in one too. She had been taught in Vienna according to the principles of the Wiener Werkstätte. So this was a sort of progressive alliance almost of different artists working in Vienna in different media. Very influential, we see their style later in the kind of Art Deco or the Bauhaus. And they were really wanting to establish a unifying aesthetic across architecture, interiors, and then kind of furniture and objects, so everything together. And they called that a total work of art, or a Gesamtkunstwerk is the German word. So that's what Rie had been brought up in, that tradition of thinking about everything together. And in her kind of early career, she was making a kind of earthenware pots in a kind of, I think, yeah, that's right, in the kind of much more pared back style. These kind of, you can see them here, and those were the first ones that Danny pointed out to us in the tour as well, you know, in the first room. So originally Rie is working in this very pared back kind of style, and she's really thinking about making pots that echo the kind of modern buildings and the architecture that she's surrounded by. She's thinking about the architect who designed her father's surgery, Wimmer, or Joseph Hoffmann, who was a very famous architect, the founder of the Werkstätte. He taught Rie, he was a great supporter of her, and he chose her works to go inside some of his really iconic buildings, including this one. So this is the Stocklet Palace that he designed, very, very kind of extreme in its kind of modern style. This is 1905 and 1911 he's designing this. But again, it's thinking about that total work of art. So we're thinking about the outside and the inside and then the furniture. And this is the dining room inside this wonderful Klimt mosaic. And this is actually eventually where he chose some of Lucie Rie's pots to be included in the interior of this very, very ornate palace. I should say it's not a royal palace, it's for private owners, but they referred to it as a palace. But so Rie is coming from this approach of thinking about buildings, working in the city, and kind of bringing those all together. So when she begins kind of making, that's that photo again, sorry, everyone has to include it, it's the law. When she starts making again in Albion Mews after the war, as I say, I'm slightly kind of jumping over the button making section here. But from 1946, she's in Albion Mews with Hans Koper, who we heard about from Katie. And the two of them are making pots, but very much thinking about interiors. They're making pots that go with modern interiors. And critics commented on this all the time in the early 50s. You know, her work was constantly sort of referenced to how it looked so well in a fashionable modern setting. And she's making this kind of domestic tableware you can see on the right, and there's a wonderful selection of it in the first room downstairs against one of the walls. Wonderful palette of cream, kind of chocolate brown with this sgraffito decoration. But thinking about how it would look, and intended, as her biographer Tony Burke said, it was intended for the house, but not necessarily always for use. So some of her pieces are very much functional, coffee cups to drink out of, but some of them are kind of more aesthetic. They are there to be looked at. But her work was of a domestic scale at this point in the early 50s, and was very attractive to stores such as Heels on Tottenham Court Road, that very, very kind of fashionable department store. And we see it in how it's promoted at this time as well. So these are some details I took from the design in the festival booklet, which accompanied the Festival of Britain in 1951. And what we can see here is Rie ceramics entirely in a kind of useful domestic setting. And this lamp base is by Rie. So this is it fitted up, not the shade was by someone else, but the base itself is. And this fruit bowl here is by Rie. And in the booklet, they're given as by Lucie Rie, Albion Mews, W2. So she's always still, you know, she's still in Albion Mews then. But it's just interesting to see how it was presented. And also, I was surprised to kind of see this image in, this is House and Garden in November 1951. And it's a Hans Koper jug, which is sort of being talked about. And it says, Hans Koper's big jug with sgraffito decoration has an almost sculptural feel where it is placed here in Lucie Rie's simple living room. So she's using her own living room here as a kind of backdrop for this very kind of modern pot. And I think it's interesting, this idea is sort of branding, or when we think of like lifestyle branding nowadays, I think Rie is actually very astute in realizing that her beautiful, very modern looking living room really sets off her and Koper's pots, and she's using this as a way of kind of demonstrating how they might look for other kind of wealthy people who have these kinds of interiors. And here you get a little snapshot of her living room in 1951 with this combination of this very angular furniture and then these kind of more traditional, this is a Windsor chair. But the kind of contrast is quite interesting. And I will also come back to the fact that she's got flowers in the jug here as well. But the interior was the first in her life over which she'd had complete control. She wasn't living with her family or with her husband. And it was conceived in this single kind of modern tradition. But it was not, as Edmund de Waal put it, it's not an original interior, it's as much an emigre as its occupant. So this is not something she's designed from scratch exactly. Despite the antipathy she felt towards her home country, towards Vienna, towards even her marriage with Hans, she had made the decision shortly before the outbreak of war to transport the modern interior from their Viennese flat, have it packed up, shipped to London and retrofitted into Albion Mews. So this is a huge undertaking, and this is all of that shelving we were looking at is actually come all the way from Vienna. So this is how her flat looked when she lived in Vienna. So this is pre-London, this is pre-war. She and Hans lived at 24 Waldseile. Interestingly, that's actually where she also had her own studio at home. She took her pots elsewhere to be fired in Vienna, but she was working at home. But they had this very, very kind of stark interior designed for them by their friend, the architect Ernst Plischke. And he designed it in 1928 and fitted it in. And here you can see kind of different views of the apartment, but you can see all this walnut shelving in different kind of configurations. And he trained under the architect, Plischke, I should say, had trained under the architect Peter Behrens and Le Corbusier. Well, it was influenced by Le Corbusier. And he'd really set out to design a modern, angular interior. This is what he wanted to do. And Rie later said of him, "For me, he was the best architect in Vienna. He built pure, beautiful houses using simple lines. He taught me what was necessary and what was going on in buildings and sculpture." And this was entirely tailored to the flat and to the Ries themselves. The chairs were made according to the measurements of Hans Rie's legs. So Plischke came and measured his legs to make sure that the seat would be exactly the right kind of size for him to sit in. So this is, very bespoke kind of tailored interior. And it was full of kind of space-saving ideas. You can hide everything away so it looks really tidy. And it was really celebrated. The reason these photographs were taken in 1930 is because Plischke was so pleased with how it had turned out. He wanted it recorded kind of, for his future career. And that's why we have the photos of this flat. No one at this point knew that Lucie Rie was going to become kind of world famous kind of artist and potter. But it was because of the success of the interior that these were recorded. And it took a huge amount of money and organisation and permits to get this shipped all the way to London. But that probably financed by Rie's uncle Sandor, her beloved uncle Sandor, who was also very wealthy. But she was very well connected as refugees kind of go, and she was fortunate that she could have this interior shipped across. And some people have suggested that this has been a kind of an attempt by Rie to preserve part of her Viennese identity in London, bring some of it with her. Or maybe some people have said it symbolised her relationship with Plischke, who Emanuel Cooper thought was much more than a friend. Or perhaps she just loved how it looked. Maybe she loved its restrained, crisp simplicity, or maybe it just felt like home. We don't know exactly what her motivations were, but she had it shipped all the way. But it meant it had to be completely adapted to be fitted into Albion Mews. It's a much smaller space. But you can see here how it was kind of moved around and reconfigured. And the open shelving and some of the cabinets were installed in the showroom, which is what we're looking at here, where they were used by Rie to display her kind of finished pots, kind of exemplars of her work. And the rest of the units were actually fitted in the sitting room upstairs in one kind of long line. But I think juggling and rearranging, adapting a previous life to fit the new is a kind of an obvious metaphor for the émigré experience. And as I say, Rie was well off, and she was had come to London, though, she was well off, but had come to London with very few possessions in the first place. Although, as Danny pointed out, she did bring some of her pots actually with her in that first instance in her suitcase. But over time, yes, of course.
Do you have a date for that particular photograph?
On the left, no, that's undated, that photo.
Right.
Why do you ask? Just wondering.
It just looks quintessentially kind of 60s.
Yes, it does look very 60s. Well, it is interesting because we will see this cabinet, this shelving again and again. Yeah. And what's so interesting is that she does move everything around all the time. So you never see it looking the same, which I think is quite interesting. But you're right, because we don't see many of the later styles of work on that shelving. So I think you're right in that it probably is kind of 60s. This one is much later, that's kind of 80s, but I think that one may well be 60s. But yes, so she's moving the pots around them all the time to kind of show off her kind of new and best work. And over time, of course, they really start to fill up it makes a very kind of a great visual impact, and you can see why people always wanted to photograph her in front of this shelving unit. But the house was also full of other objects. You know, it wasn't just the shelving. She'd filled it full of lots of other things, and that had meaning to her. And this is where I'm going to come back to the ceramics I pointed out earlier. So next to the shelving unit in the showroom is this moon jar. It's a Korean moon jar. It's called a moon jar because of partly of its form, but it has great kind of resonance within Korean culture. And it was a gift to Lucie Rie from Bernard Leach, who we heard about earlier. So there's a great letter that Bernard Leach, we don't quite know why, but this moon jar was with a friend of his in London, actually Jean Milne, a brilliant, very amazing carpet kind of weaver. And he wrote a letter to Rie, and it was during the war, and he said, will you go take a taxi, go to her house and just take back this and another pot, the moon jar. And then he said, and keep the Korean pot in memory of me. So it became kind of Rie's pot from the kind of war onwards. And we see it doesn't ever really move. The Snowdon photograph earlier was interesting because they moved it especially for the photograph, but it actually always stayed in this corner. And this is really kind of, for Rie, kind of a symbol of her friendship with Bernard Leach, who, as we heard from Katie, was so critical of her work when she first came to England, but became a great friend of hers and a great supporter. And so this pot is kind of always on display. And as were these set of 7 jugs in descending size. You can just see them here as well. These Lucie made for her friend and neighbour Stanley North. He lived just along the road in the Mews. But he very sadly died suddenly in 1942. But just before he died, he'd actually given them back to her to say that he thought that they belonged in the pottery, that he thought they looked better in her house than in his. So he'd given them back to her. And she kept them on display in remembrance of him on that table for the rest of her life. And, I've just said, yes, I've got a better photo of that moon jar there, just so you really get a sense of it. It's very large, it's about this big. And this is now in the British Museum's collection, that actual moon jar. It was later given, I think if I remember correctly, Lucie Rie left it to Janet Leach, who had been Bernard's third wife, and then Janet Leach left it to the British Museum, so they now have it in their collection. But also, of course, the other incredibly important person to Lucie Rie in terms of Albion Mews is Hans Koper, who, again, Katie gave us a great kind of overview of his kind of work. And he'd been there with Rie until 1958. He moved out in 1958. He didn't ever live there, but he moved his studio kind of practice out to his own space in 1958. But this gives a sense of the kind of work that Koper was making in the 60s. I think these photos are all 1960s. Some of them are taken by his wife, Jane Koper, who's a brilliant photographer. And this is how they were presented. You know, they were very much seen as kind of sculptural works of art, and that's how they were presented. The photo on the top right is from an exhibition at the Victorian Albion Museum in 1969. It was Hans Koper with the weaver Peter Collingwood, and these were kind of 2 great kind of contemporary artists put together in that exhibition. But this is how generally the works were regarded. People were sort of very, as we heard, he was so influential to a whole generation of studio potters kind of below him in terms of his forms, his approach to making. And he'd been, of course, very, very important to Rie in, as Katie said, encouraging her to follow her own kind of gut in terms of her making and not listen to Bernard Leach and just do actually what she wanted to do. And he died also very, very young, I should say, in 1981. He was only 61, which was a great shock to Rie when he died too. But these are how we normally see Koper's pots. This is how they're displayed. But this is not how Lucie Rie displayed her Koper pots. She displayed them like this instead, which is entirely different. Very unusual to see flowers poking out of what are kind of regarded as icons of mid-century modernism. But this is how Rie displayed Koper pots in her sitting room upstairs. And it's interesting that although Rie very much always said that he was an artist, that was what she always said about Cowper. I'm a potter, he is an artist. But yet this is how she chose to kind of use his pots. And it was pointed out to her that this is the sort of sacrilege was the word used by the former keeper of ceramics at the Viennese. He visited Lucie Rie and he said, if anyone else showed them like that, it would be sacrilege to have all these flowers sticking out of Hans Cowper pots. But Rie claimed that she did it because that's how Cowper displayed his pots at home. Don't know if this is true or not, but she claimed that his wife Jane often collected flowers and put them in the Cowper pots at home. And so I think by redoing that, by recopying what she thought Cowper was doing, she's very much kind of aligning herself with him and not with all of the other curators, collectors, connoisseurs. She's saying that they've got a more personal connection than that. And I think that's really what's kind of going on in her showing these kind of his pots, using them like this. And then it's interesting as well, we touched on the masculine-feminine divide of Cowper and Rie, because it is something that has been written about a lot when their work is often displayed alongside one another. And the general kind of commentary is often kind of, Rie's work is so much more feminine than Cowper's. And we also see that the commentary because of the way she worked. People found her way of working very domestic. And it's constantly a refrain we hear about Rie is that, she's at home, in this kind of small, compact, urban environment kind of making. She's not digging the clay and, shoveling the wood in the kiln and that kind of, all of that, those practices we associate with kind of rural potters. And although that's quite discomforting, I think, for us in the 21st century to read about Rie being kind of spoken about in this way, I must say it didn't really seem to bother Rie herself. She was quite comfortable in some ways with the gendering of her work. And also she had quite strong feelings herself about kind of that. She very openly always claimed that she was a man's woman, which again I think is something we don't hear very much these days, but that was very much her take on her kind of relationships with her friends and customers, lots and lots of I think she made people feel very special, and she was really successful in creating intimacy and kind of made people feel like she was really listening to them. Because the way she used Albion Mews is quite interesting in that she didn't have big open days. She wasn't sort of like, everyone come along and this afternoon, No. She had a very tight diary. People had particular slots. She didn't like people overlapping. It was one person in, one person out. It was kind of, there wasn't a kind of free-for-all at all. And I think that's why people, when you read accounts of people's time with Lucie Rie and Albion Mews, they really cherish the kind of the time with her up in her sitting room. This is her in her sitting room later in life in the 1980s. You can also still see some Cowper pots with grass sticking out of them there on the top. But she was really successful in creating a kind of intimacy where everyone had a slot. And her hosting, as I say, was legendary, which also there's quite a gendered aspect to that too. She's in the kitchen and sort of voila, kind of amazing cakes and meals and coffee. And some people, again, some critics have argued that is that a self-consciousness from being an outsider? Is it an overcompensation from her sort of feeling like she needs to make people feel welcome and fit in? But Rie herself, she knew that she encouraged all these visitors. She was aware that she overfilled her diary and sometimes complained she had very little time to actually make pots. And towards the end of her life, it did get too much because, of course, she's getting more and more famous all the time. More and more people want to come and look at the shelving and choose a pot and have tea and it was a huge pressure, but she said, I do not go out. I can either become a hermit or I can learn about the world by having guests. I chose to have guests. So it was actually her way of experiencing the world, was to have people in. And I think there's also an element of control that once people are in Albion Mews, she is controlling that kind of experience and that interaction. And but it's interesting that she didn't want people to stay for too long. I found an interesting detail in the Emmanuel Cooper biography of Lucie Rie, in that upstairs, so even people who had made it upstairs, the sort of, which it wasn't everyone, but people who did, she had the couch in that space. The original couch had been covered in a kind of an itchy fabric, an itchy material, so not entirely comfortable. And when it needed to be reupholstered, Rie asked that it also be, she asked Peter Collingwood to make a fabric which included horsehair in it. to ensure that it remained a bit uncomfortable. So I think it's interesting that there's an element of not wanting her guests to get too comfortable, because she's aware of the next people who are going to be coming in an hour's time, which I think is kind of a little insight into how she felt about some of this. But she was kind of able to provide this environment that people also felt was completely timeless, because the interior didn't change. Yes, Eleanor? 5 minutes? Oh, sorry, thank you. I'm getting there. And it didn't change. So people really felt if they'd visited in the 60s and they came back in the 80s, it still looked exactly the same, apart from the pots moving around. And there's this kind of sense of timelessness to that. And people really, really enjoyed it. And it became part of her kind of construction, I think, of her life in England, her life as a potter. And it enabled her to orchestrate all of these journalists, visitors, towards the end of her life, film crews, photographers, people who wanted to interview her. She welcomed them all into Albion Mews, and then she was kind of able to control those interactions. And it's interesting that the critic Hetty Judah has said that throughout the 20th century, photography and film entered many artist studios, making public spectacle of this private space, turning it into a cipher for the artist's creative process, transforming the studio into a mechanism for generating aura. And I think in latter decades, Rie definitely embraced the aura of her studio and used it as a backdrop for all of these interviews, these articles, these films, which accompanied her expanding reputation. But she suffered a stroke, as we heard, in 1990, and then afterwards she barely left Albion Mews. She was essentially housebound. She was cared for by round-the-clock care workers, but at home. Her sitting room was the site of her investiture as a dame in 1991, and she died at home in Albion Mews a month after that. 4 years after that, 1995. So I think the significance, though, of Albion Mews and to Rie's life and to her practice can really only be, we can sort of see how important it was by what happened after her death. So I'm just going to run through a couple of legacies of Albion Mews that exist today. The first was the Royal Commission on the Historical Monuments of England, which was an organisation, a commission that went out to capture buildings and interiors that were seen as key and important to English national life. They chose to photograph and document all of Rie's spaces in Albion Mews, and you can see some of those photographs downstairs in the display. The second thing that happened was that her studio was packed up. It actually belongs to, the title was transferred to the Pottery Museum an art gallery in Stoke-on-Trent, but it's actually on kind of long-term loan to the Victorian Albion Museum, and you can see it reconstructed on the top floor there in a corner of the ceramics gallery. So kind of a hagiography, to Rie's practice, to her skill. And of course, what's really interesting is that the interior was still of interest. This is still an important Pliska interior. And although Rie had very mixed feelings about Austria during her lifetime, she wasn't keen to exhibit there. She still felt very angry, quite rightly so, about what had happened in the 30s, but she agreed that after her death, the interior could go back to Vienna, go back to Austria, and it is now in the collection of the Holburne Museum in Vienna, which is a kind of furniture and interiors museum, and it's been reconstructed, but it's been reconstructed as it was in her original apartment in Vienna. So it's kind of been recycled again. It's gone back to its original kind of usage. And we can see this is the living room, and then this is the bedroom, actually, which was not configured at all like this in Albion Mews. But interesting that it's had a sort of third life. This interior has gone on to go back to Vienna, to go back full circle. And then, of course, where would it be without a blue plaque? There's a blue plaque at 18 Albion Mews. You can walk down there today and see it. It's someone's private home, so maybe don't stare in the windows. But you can see this blue plaque today. And so I think altogether this represents a large legacy for what was a very small building. And it serves to illustrate the widespread admiration for Rie's work and her distinctive way of life. Thank you very much.